It's the very definition of being radical, that you're totally inflexible and not interested in compromising in any way, shape, or form. So that's the people who refuse to use transgender people's preferred pronouns. That's often how they think. And I think that you get a radical push from trans activists, saying like, you cannot question this for the kids at all. And I think the backlash has been so extreme that has in turn radicalized people on the other side who now won't give an inch on their end of things. And that has created an incredibly combustible scenario that we're in now with what, in theory at least, Donald Trump might wreak upon transgender people of all ages upon being president again.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. I am here with returning guest, Ben Ryan. Ben is an independent journalist specializing in science and healthcare coverage. He's contributed to numerous publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, NBC News, and The Washington Post. He's especially interested in public health, medicine, and psychology, and how these intersect with public policy. You can find him on Substack, where his publication is called Hazard Ratio, and we're going to be talking about a number of his recent posts. Ben, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be back. I hope these unprecedented times find you well, Meghan.
Yes, it gets more unprecedented every day.
Yes.
So you were here last spring to talk about the impact of the Cass review. Part of what I want to do in this conversation is talk with you about what has changed, if anything, in the gender debate since the release of the Cass review and what's going on with the various voices in this debate. But first, can you just briefly remind the audience, what was the Cass review and why was it significant?
So the Cass review was commissioned by the National Health Service, or NHS, which is the centralized health authority in the United Kingdom. And Hilary Cass was tapped to run the review. She is a renowned pediatrician in the country, and there's a lot of debate back and forth about whether she was the right person for the job, because you'll hear a lot of trans activist allies say that she had no experience working with young trans people, therefore she never should have had this position. But that was actually why she was hired for the job, was because she had something of a blank slate. And this is something that you hear a lot in the evidence-based medicine space, where you don't ideally want to have a full stack of people on, say, a guidelines committee who have a vested professional and commercial interest, financial interest in the outcomes of the guidelines. You want to at least have some balance where there are people who just are sort of rudimentary evidence-based medicine experts or some sort of outside experts to take more of a bird's eye view. So that's what happened with Dr. Cass. And so she spent 4 years on this. And part of what she did was she commissioned systematic literature reviews from the University of York in England, from evidence-based medicine experts there. And they conducted 7 different reviews of all different kind of facets of youth gender medicine, including the use of puberty blockers, use of cross-sex hormones, social transition, as well as the different guidelines that exist around the world from different groups, both in the United States and other like national health authorities in Scandinavia, et cetera, to analyze the strength of the evidence. And essentially what those very dispassionate analyses found was that the strength of the evidence is weak and uncertain, and all of the claims that you hear bandied about, especially here in the United States, with this being a very combustible political issue, and increasingly so even after the election, with lots of people saying that's one of the reasons perhaps that Harris lost, is this notion that this is highly effective care, that there are all these numbers of studies, this has been used so often prescribing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to kids that we definitely know this works and it's life-saving. So those claims are essentially unsupported by evidence. And that's one of the main thrusts that came out of the Cass review being published in April, was this becoming a much more globally established story, which before might have been a bit more in the far corners of academia, which is that we really don't know the answers to these questions about how best to care for this burgeoning population of adolescents in particular adolescent natal girls who are very distressed about their gender and who are at least seeking answers potentially in medicalizing to essentially change their sex grades to appear as the opposite sex. And that gets into all sort of philosophical debates whether it really are changing sex and what gender essentialism is. But, on a very surface clinical level, what you're doing is trying to change your body so that you appear as the opposite sex.
Okay. And we've covered this a lot on this podcast. I think most of the audience is familiar with a lot of the different dimensions of this discussion. What has changed in the last 6 months in the wake of the cast review? Because I think when it came out, there was this kind of feeling among sort of those of us in the gender critical space. I don't know how you want to call it. That's like, okay, the jury is in. This debate is over.
The dam is breaking.
Let's move on.
You hear that all the time,
right?
Yeah.
So has that come to fruition?
In some ways, yes. In one way that it really has, the cast review has worked its way into the American system is through the legal system. So you'll see it mentioned in all sorts of legal briefs now and legal decisions. So many of the amicus briefs that have been submitted to the Supreme Court for the Scrimetti case, Jonathan Scrimetti is the Attorney General in Tennessee, and the court case that has gone to the Supreme Court and will be heard on December 4th in oral arguments is with regards to that state's ban of gender transition treatments for minors. So, a flood of amicus briefs came in the late summer and fall, on both sides of this argument. So you see a lot of those who are supporting the ban in Tennessee, citing cast review as being an authoritative voice on this issue, that this is not supported by evidence. And you can get really into the minutiae of the law here because, as I've understood from my own reporting, the case itself is a fairly arcane, narrow legal question about the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and does banning this treatment for minors, is that essentially is that a violation of the Equal Protection Clause? Is that affecting a sex-based class? And does that therefore justify the use of what's called strict scrutiny when you're trying to decide whether or not the lawmakers are being capricious? So if it isn't a quasi-suspect or suspect classes, these different gradations of what you think of as these groups of trans children and how they're seen under the law, it's a much lower bar to clear. So in any case, there are all sorts of other cases that are working their way through the system. But in terms of what's happened also in the public space is we've seen a lot of reporting about what's going on behind the scenes in the American Academy of Pediatrics and what's called the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. The WPATH is what one member described to me as a quasi-activist medical group. It's an unusual setup because in order to be a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, you have to be a pediatrician, you have to be board certified, that sort of thing. You might not have to be board certified, but you have to be a pediatrician. Whereas WPATH they'll take lawyers, they'll take activists. So that very structure has created in them a kind of machine that is very primarily interested in the vested interest of advocacy. And you hear the way, this is, not a matter of debate because you hear how they talk in private. And what happened is that the Alabama Attorney General, he subpoenaed for their own court case over the federal case over their ban of pediatric gender medicine. He subpoenaed all these records from WPATH, and they got a lot of them. And spent over a year processing them with this guy James Cantor. Did this on their behalf. He's a very controversial sex researcher in Canada who testifies in all these court cases against or on behalf of these bans. And they started to unseal all these documents in June. And so that is how we learned several things. One, that Admiral Rachel Levine is a transgender woman who is the Assistant Secretary of Health in HHS in the Biden administration. So in early 2022, WPATH was on the 11th hour of finishing their revision of their standards of care of their 8th edition. So standards of care, that's capital S, capital C, which is confusing because the standard of care is, a medical and also legal term. And so they laid those two right on top of each other. So nothing get confused that these are the standards of care. In any case, they were revising that for the 8th edition, which ultimately was published that fall, which gives all these kind of guidelines of care, how to care for transgender adults and children in their different chapters. And so Admiral Levine in early 2022 was either, if not the first, then among the first people to receive an embargoed copy of the draft of these guidelines.
And is that standard? Would somebody in that position always get
I can't answer that question, so I don't know the answer to that question. But in any case, she was putting pressure on them to remove the age limits on. She was especially concerned with surgeries, but treatments as well, meaning puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And so there was a lot of back and forth of her pressuring them. And she said, and someone from her office said that this was explicitly for political reasons. They were concerned. And the logic of this sometimes escapes me, but the argument, at least, that her office was presenting was that if these age limits were there, it would somehow aid and abet the various efforts to ban. Maybe it would sort of seem like, oh, well, our desire to have age limits is only in keeping with what the standards of care are from WPATH. I suppose that's what the argument was. So he wasn't that explicit about it. So time went on. There was a bit of pressure happening in, I think, the spring and early summer from Rachel Levine. And then we also saw unsealed emails that showed that the AAP, at the 11th hour in the fall, WPATH was about to publish their SOC 8, as it's called, the Standards of Care 8. And the AAP said WPATH was trying to recruit all of these different medical organizations to endorse them. They really wanted to make a full show of support. The AMA told them, we don't endorse anybody, and they were freaking out. And one of their leaders called them, I think it was white cis hat hillbillies. I forget exactly all the words, but the word like hillbilly was thrown in there.
TV show title.
This guy was so enraged that the AMA, as a matter of policy, by the way, would not endorse them. So it speaks to sort of, you hear that people saying that cisgender is a slur. In this case, in that case, yes, it is being used as a slur. In any case, the AAP said, if you don't take out, this is all in private, the fall of 22, if you don't take out the age limits, then not only will we not endorse this, but we will come out against the SOC 8. And the WPATH capitulated. They published, I think it was October 2022, they published the Standards of Care 8, and they took it down really fast and they republished it. So they made a mistake. And then in the second version, they had taken out the age limits. And then Marcy Bowers, who at least at the time was the president of WPATH, she's a very successful gender-affirming surgeon out of California, who, as we learned from a deposition in the Alabama case that was unsealed, makes over $1 million a year from these surgeries.
And is transgender herself.
And is herself a transgender woman. She colluded with the others. She said, what is our cover story? I mean, this happens all the time, and coming up with a cover. We're not going to say we really fired you. We're going to say it's spend time with your family. But they colluded, through email of what the cover story they were going to say of why they took out the age limits in the last second. And you see a lot of other things in their discussions about, for example, the concept of medically necessary care was a concept that they threw in there, not because it grew out of any research that had proved that these types of surgeries and treatments are medically necessary, but both to secure insurance coverage and also to win anticipated lawsuits. You can see them discussing that. We've discussed it with Chase and the gang. Chase is invariably a reference to Chase Strangio, who was what had litigators in the ACLU for transgender-related matters, who, at least in theory, will be presenting a 15-minute oral argument and before the Supreme Court in December, the first time a openly transgender person has done that. So you hear a lot about the sausage is made, and the bottom line that you're hearing from this is a lack of transparency and a kind of reverse engineering to win anticipated battles, which is ironic because then now we find out that we did that only works against them. So the overall public image of the main players in the transgender medicine space has been greatly damaged in recent months. The Cass review was just one among many different elements that have really, I think, increasingly turned the public against medicalizing transitions for children. And then, of course, Donald Trump just kind of put the nail in the coffin in certain ways, not to say the debate is over, but the reason, apparently, according to the New York Times reporting, that Trump spent tens of millions of dollars on the ads attacking Kamala Harris for her policies and the Democratic Party's policies on transgender issues is because they tested very well, better than all the other attack ads. And it would seem from some polling that we've seen, some exit polling, that indeed there were some of the swing voters who really are uncomfortable with the Democratic Party's policies when it comes to transgender kids, not just with the medicalization, but also participating in sports and the bathroom issue.
Right. So these were the ads that said Kamala Harris is for they, them. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is for you.
Right.
Okay.
Apparently it was a very successful tagline.
Right. So thank you for laying all of that out. I mean, one thing I keep wondering and trying to understand is who in the Biden administration and in the sort of Democratic Party machine more broadly is actually invested in this stuff does it really just come down to a few key people? Like, you've been listening to a premium episode of the Unspeakable podcast. To hear the rest of the conversation, become a paying subscriber at megandaum.substack.com or theunspeakablepodcast.com. Hope to see you over there. Thanks.